Okay, so today we're going to read through the article about rabbi-messas written by Professor Mark Shapiro, who wrote extensively on Halakha analysis, and he speaks about the definition of orthodoxy and how it fits in the Sephardic world. And where does rabbi-messas fit within that category? So Shapiro writes here about the concept of orthodoxy, that Orthodox Jews like to claim that they adhere to an unchanging tradition of laws and beliefs. And we go through the paragraphs of what he writes. This is indeed the way Orthodox Jews look at themselves, as there are certain dogmas that must be followed. There's a dress code, there's a halachic code, there are minhagim and observances. The interesting thing is that within Orthodoxy, you will go into certain communities, and each one of them behaves a little differently, but there seems to be an overarching understanding of what Orthodoxy is. As he says here, the term Orthodoxy itself is not an integral part of Jewish thought. It comes from the Christian lexicon. It's really it's made from the two words ortho, which means straight or rigid, and dox, which is dogma. So clear, straight, rigid set of ideas. That ties into a discussion that we had earlier in the beginning of this course regarding the emphasis that the Sephardic rabbis always, from the time of the Golden Age in Spain and on, they put a very strong emphasis on the study of Tanakh. You had to be well versed in Tanakh. There was an obligation mentioned in Maimonides, in Halakha, and later on in Shulchan Aruch, obligation on the father to hire a tutor for his children to teach them what is called 24 Sifrei Mikra, the 24 books of the Tanakh. And that understanding that you have to know Tanakh stems from the understanding that this is the one part of our literature which is divine. This is the divine law. The rest is man-made. And as such, when you read Tanakh, you understand the full scope of the divine law. And with that, have in mind that when you look at the Torah, and even with the additional information that we have in the Tanakh, the Torah does not have a rigid dogma. The Torah has certain flexibility within the legal system and also within the system of beliefs. And when you go to Tanakh, the flexibility is even greater. You have books of like Job and Yirmiyahu, and in Psalms in certain parts, that question certain beliefs and analyze them, and everything is given to a certain understanding and analysis. And as time moved on, as we moved into rabbinic literature, as the writing of the Mishnah, the writing of Maimonides, of Shulchan Aruch, we put the Halakha into certain frames and certain boxes that cannot be moved. And the term orthodoxy was actually coined in the for Jews. The term Jewish orthodoxy probably was coined in the 19th century. That had to do with the elections to the Senate in Poland, the same, in which Jews were also part. So there was one party that was created and ran on this platform of orthodoxy, which was actually a counterattack or a response to the creation of the reform movement, or the neologists in the other European countries. So this is the concept of orthodoxy, which was not originally a Jewish concept. In the Sephardic world, and that's also something that we spoke about, you cannot find the label Sephardic Orthodox. You will find it today, but it's pretty much a new term. And maybe people use it in the last 20, 30, or maybe even 50 years, but still it's not integral to the Sephardic experience. Sephardic communities did not split along these lines of Reform Conservative, and I think that part of the reason that it did not happen is that the rabbis of the Sephardic communities were flexible, and that flexibility allowed them to accept certain changes within the community and also to accommodate people of different levels of observance or belief. Whereas in the Ashkenazi community, the tendency was uniformity. Everybody had to conform with one rule, with one ideology. That in itself ties part to the different influences of Islam and Christianity. We spoke about that. It also, because of the different influences of Islam and Christianity, Jews in medieval Spain were willing to embrace the general culture, which was back then the Muslim culture. Talking about early medieval Spain, from the 10th to the 12th centuries, created the Golden Age in Spain, and with that they were exposed to modern culture and sciences, and therefore were not overwhelmed by other cultures that Jews in Europe were exposed to with the emancipation, and with that they created Orthodoxy. So, in a nutshell, we could say that Orthodoxy and the split into different movement, Reform, Conservative, etc., are a result of being very rigid and not allowing flexibility within the realm of Halakha and ideology. And on that note, it's interesting to mention that the one place within the Middle Eastern continuum, and we could say general the Sephardic world, where there was an attempt to create a reform community, was in Aleppo in the 1850s. Rabbi Raphael Katzin, who started as a rabbi in Syria and then traveled to Iraq, then to Europe, and then he came back. This Rabbi Kassin, or as he's called in Hebrew, Katzin, tried to start a reform community. Not reform the way the reform movement runs the congregations today, but the reformed compared to the way the synagogues or the congregations worked back then. And there was great opposition, and eventually it was ran down by the authorities of the religious establishment. And after he passed away, this whole story was erased, was expunged from the history books of the Jewish communities, and they created a story according to which he was mentally ill or possessed by demons, etc., because they couldn't explain the fact that he went in that direction. But my reading of that story, which by the way you could find detailed description of the story in a book by Professor Yaron Harel, Intrigues and Revolutions. Yaron Harel is one of the leading experts on the life of Jews in the Ottoman Empire in the modern time, from the 17th century on. To me, it's interesting that of all the communities in the Middle East, the place where there was an attempt to start a reform community was Aleppo, because Aleppo was relatively the most fanatic and most close-minded of the Sephardic communities. If you know of the two major communities of Syria, Aleppo and Damascus, Damascus was more the metropolis that was open to the whole world and more acculturated, more modern. Aleppo was considered a sort of a backwater community, and the rabbis were very controlling and very rigid in their rulings. So to me, it's almost a clear correlation between the rigid leadership of the rabbis and the attempt to find and to create new movements within Judaism, even though in that case it didn't succeed. So now I'm going back to Professor Shapiro's article. He gives us certain examples of how orthodoxy changes. For example, he says, when I was younger, everyone knew that according to orthodoxy, Jews were not permitted to ascend the Temple Mount. Now, many Orthodox Jews do precisely that. And there are actually movements, people who try to go and make sacrifices on the Kotel the authorities every holiday they search people who come up to make sure they're not bringing a shofar or prayer books, etc., to do it there, and that was a reaction to a reality which we spoke about in many cases in this course of people confronting a certain situation. When the rabbis recognize it as a problem, they will find a halachic solution. But only then, I think this is what he's hinting to, only then it will be considered orthodox. Meaning, if it comes from the people, it will not be considered orthodoxy. If it is done by individuals, it will not be considered orthodox. But if the majority of the rabbis who identify themselves as orthodox will get together and will decide that a certain halakha is changed, then it will be orthodox. So it's sort of a self-contained mechanism that is controlled from within, and there's no acknowledgement or recognition of the will of the people or the reality, unless it is something that the rabbis themselves feel about. So this is one example that he gives. And then he says, a generation ago, the notion that women could read the Torah or get aliyot in an Orthodox synagogue would have been laughed at, and it was the reason why some people came with the idea of women's prayer groups. Today, we have Orthodox minyanim in which women are called to the Torah. Now, that is, of course, it's not within the world of Orthodoxy. That would be called modern Orthodoxy, open Orthodoxy, etc. There will be a sub-label attached to it. Even though, which was interesting, if you go back to the Talmud says that a woman can get an aliyah. Even though, as we mentioned before, in the Sephardic world, women got aliyah, most famously for Sassoon, the wife of Sleman Sassoon, when she came back visiting from Iraq, going to when she was in India, and she went visiting the Iraqi communities along the way, she received an aliyah in some of the synagogues. And when he wrote that, he says, we will have Orthodox women rabbis. We already have something like that. And that also, in the Sephardic world, existed already. The first woman who served as rabbi in modern time was Osnat Barazani in northern Iraq, Kurdistan, in the 17th century, who served as a rabbi, as the head of the yeshiva, after her father and her husband passed away. So Shapiro continues to say that reality is that orthodoxy is not so much a concept as a social construct. As I said before, it's about the rabbis controlling the communities, and within that social setting, they have to keep people together, and with that rule for them, and to keep them under a certain umbrella. And it says, with this understanding, it should not be surprising that what the Torah true population regard as unacceptable in one era could very well be regarded differently among at least some of this population at another time. So, another element that we mentioned is important, extremely important in studying Halakha, and was essential for Sephardic rabbis, and especially rabbi-messas, he mentioned it several times, is the understanding of history. Without a clear historical view of each and every halakha that you discuss, you cannot reach a binding or a comprehensive conclusion. So when rabbi-messas, for example, approaches the question of hair covering, he goes all the way back to the Talmud. He looks at the sources of the Torah, and he asks the question, how did people dress at that time? How can I explain the phenomenon that today many Orthodox women do not cover their hair? And then he comes up with a solution. When, for example, he discusses a book, rabbi-messas discusses a book that was printed by the grandchildren of Rabbi Yitzhak ben Walid, who was a famous Moroccan scholar. So he writes a review of the introduction a review of the book, and he says one of the problems of the book that in the introduction to the book, the children or the grandchildren of the author wrote a lot about the illustrious personality of the author, who he was, and the miracles that are attributed to him. But what they didn't write where and when he lived. So Rabbi Mesas says that in order to understand a certain halakha, you have to know who wrote that halakha and when, and where did he live, because the circumstances of the life of that rabbi influences halakha. If I take, for example, this concept and apply it to the halakha of Maimonides, there's another great, maybe the greatest Sephardic halakha personality. There is a trend today. A lot of my friends are among those people who adhere completely to Maimonides, and they say we follow the halakha of Maimonides. We are Maimonidean Jews. So the question is, do you really follow every halakha? So someone told me actually this weekend. He says, my friend, Rabbi, this and that, follows the halakha according to Maimonides. He's a strict Maimonidean. I asked him, how often does the wife of that rabbi leave the house? Because Maimonides says in Mishnah Torah, Gnayu la'isha sheteh yotzet min habayit pa'am b'shuk pa'am b'chovot. It is not respectful for a woman to be traveling too much outside in the marketplace, in the streets. She should sit at home and leave only once or twice a month. I said, if your friend, that rabbi, is really a Maimonidean, then he should not let his wife out of the house more than once or twice a month. Since he doesn't do that, it means that he takes from Maimonides only that which he finds acceptable. So he is picking and choosing. If you pick and choose, then you have to ask the next question. Had Maimonides come back to life today, would he rule the same way he ruled back then? I could definitely bet on that specific halakha, that had Maimonides lived today, he would not speak in the same way about women, because that was influenced by the society in which he lived. 11th century Egypt, he has a different view of women. They're a different role in society. Back then, it was really not appropriate for a woman to be outside, or because it was not done in the general Muslim society. Maimonides didn't think that it would be appropriate for her to do it as a Jewish woman. Today, Maimonides, I think, would be the greatest supporter of women being ordained as rabbis and leading Jewish, not just Jewish learning, but communities. So the question that we should ask is, if you want to follow Maimonides, not how do I follow Maimonides to the letter, what he wrote in his Mishneh Torah, but rather, what would he write and say today? So try to cull as much information from his writing and from his analysis to try to understand what is his mode of thinking and how would he approach the issue today. And if I don't, then I have to approach it by myself or based on other or different knowledge that I gather from other authorities. So, going back to the article of Shapiro, saying that halakha changes with the times, even within Orthodoxy, and he says it is vital to bear this in mind when considering the works of Rabbi Yosef Mesas. He was born in Meknes, and he served as a rabbi in Tlemcen in Algeria, Meknes, and eventually as the chief rabbi of Haifa. The city of Tlemcen is an important city. That was the city where the Maharam al-Ashkar and Rabbi Yitzhak Bar Sheshat, who came from Spain at the end of the 14th century with the first wave of expulsions from Palma de Mallorca and other parts of Spain, they came and settled in Tlemcen, so it has a very interesting Jewish history. And he was very well known in the North African community, but as he writes here, only recently he begun to catch the interest of both the broader Orthodox world as well as the scholarly community. He mentions here the people who wrote scholarly works on him: Moshe Bar Asher, Tzvi Zohar, Avinu Amoroznak, and others, Rabbi Zechariah Zermati in the rabbinic world. has published a book about Rabbi Yosef Mesas. He calls he defines it as Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, but he calls it Hod Yosef Hai. So a comment on that book by Rabbi Zermati. I have the book. I went through it, and as much as Rabbi Zermati quotes the rulings of Rabbi Yosef Mesas, and he has tremendous respect towards him, there are still certain places where he feels uncomfortable with the ruling of Rabbi Yosef Mesas because it is not in accordance with what has become the norm in the modern Sephardic world of today. So, for example, where he speaks about kosher meat, the the terms. Are you familiar with the terms Bet Yosef or glat meat? So, originally, or not originally in America, we used to have kosher meat and glat meat. Glat literally means smooth with no questions regarding the level of kashrut of the lung. If the lung has certain appendages or pieces of meat that come out of it, it would be considered a problem. If it has none of this, it is considered glut. And there was a dispute between Rabbi Yosef Karo and Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, the Ramah, as to what is considered a kosher lung or not. It seems that the Bet Yosef or Rabbi Yosef Karo is more strict, but in practice, in most Sephardic communities, people didn't follow all the rulings of Rabbi Yosef Karo regarding the kashrut of meat, and it was only in Eretz Yisrael in the 70s when, or even later, when Rabbi Ovadia Yosef became the chief rabbi, that he started pushing what is called le'achzir atara le'yoshna, a term that we mentioned in the previous discussion, restoring the crown to its glory. And in his mind, restoring the crown to its glory was going back to the rulings of the Shulchan Aruch. So he said, from now on, in Israel, all Sephardim must follow the rulings of Rabbi Yosef Karo in the Shulchan Aruch, and only eat meat that is labeled Bet Yosef. And the meat that is labeled glat, not even mentioned kosher, but even the meat which is labeled glat by the Ashkenazi standards cannot be eaten by Sephardic Jews. Rabbi Mesas addressed this problem, and he said that one cannot deem a certain level of kashrut that many hundreds of thousands of Jews followed in the Ashkenazi communities for hundreds of years. He says if you make a distinctive statement, this is kosher and this is not, then now you're saying that all these hundreds of thousands of Jews ate non-kosher meat for hundreds of years. So this is not the way of halakha. We rule one way, you rule the other way, even though I might decide not to eat the meat that you eat, but it's still kosher. And then he says that in Morocco, when they traveled from place to place, each city had its own rules and practices regarding the manner of slaughtering and how to determine whether the meat is kosher or not. And he said that when we would travel, we knew that there was a rabbi in the city, there was a system of kashrut, we would eat the meat without asking questions, what exactly are your standards of kashrut and what are your practices? And the same thing happened in Eretz Yisrael, and when he was the chief rabbi of Haifa, there was a situation where the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Haifa, Rabbi Yoshua Kaniel, authorized the labeling of meat as kosher, and it was sold in all the markets to both Ashkenazim and Sephardim. And one Sephardic politician or activist decided that it's not kosher enough for Sephardim, and he wrote a very harsh letter to the chief rabbi, to the chief Ashkenazi rabbi, telling him, you are feeding us non-kosher meat. And the rabbi felt very distressed by that letter, and he turned to Rabbi Yosef Mesas, he showed him the letter. Rabbi Yosef Mesas, in turn, rebuked that the person who wrote the letter, and he said, how dare you label this meat as non-kosher when the chief rabbi of the city determining that it's kosher by his standards of halakha. Again, he said, if you choose not to eat from it, that's your own prerogative. But you cannot say that it's not kosher at all. That is what Rabbi Mesas says. However, when Rabbi Zechariah Zermati, mentioned here, published his book, Od Yosef Hai, in the last couple of years, it's already established and accepted in Israel that Sephardim only eat the sort of a higher standard Bet Yosef meat. So after he summarizes the halakha as written by Rabbi Yosef Mesas, he qualifies it by saying, this is only theoretical, but in practice, all Sephardim today only eat that kind of meat. So that illustrates the problem itself that Shapiro is referring to, that within the rabbinic world, even after accepting and respecting the writings of Rabbi Mesas, you still have reservations for fear maybe of retaliation or arguments within the Orthodox Sephardic communities. So yes, there's a greater awareness of the writings of Rabbi Mesas. One of the reasons, in my opinion, that his writings were sort of pushed to the corner is because the certain dispute or an old grudge that Rabbi Ovadia Yosef had with him. Since Rabbi Ovadia Yosef became the chief rabbi, he was basically the one who decided who will make it into the Hall of Fame of modern Sephardic rabbis and who will be kept outside. Not only in terms of modern rabbis, also of great rabbis who wrote in the past, because he had such a command of Hebrew literature. He had a phenomenal memory, photographic memory, and he would quote all the books that were available only as manuscripts, only in rare libraries. That was before you had electronic databases and Wikipedia and HebrewBooks.org. Everything is accessible. So if the book was mentioned in the writings of Haim Ovadia Yosef, it existed. And if it was not mentioned, it did not exist. So Rabbi Ovadia Yosef chose deliberately and systematically not to mention Rabbi Yosef Mesas, as a result, most people didn't know of the existence of his books and of the scope of his scholarship. And that was because, in my opinion, there was an incident when Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was still a very young rabbi, and he quit his position as a rabbi in Cairo, in Egypt, over a dispute he had with the leaders of the community. And then, when he saw that they were unfazed, and that they hired a French rabbi, recommended by Consistoire in France, he changed his mind and he regretted, and he wanted to get back to a position. The leaders of the community, instead of they were fighting with him back and forth, and eventually they wrote a letter to Rabbi Mesas, and they asked him, what does he think they should do? What does he rule? Because he gave his letter of resignation, and they accepted it, and now he argued that they must hire him back. So Rabbi Mesas answered. He said, what you did, the way you handled him, was inappropriate. You had to treat the rabbi with greater respect. However, now that he handed you his resignation and you accepted it, he has no claims on you anymore, and he cannot reclaim his position. And I believe it's a theory, but I see no other reason for Rabbi Ovadia Yosef to completely eschew the writings of Rabbi Yosef Mesas. Some people say, and he will say it later on, Shapiro says here, some of his rulings are so far removed from the mainstream of halachic thought that many might be tempted to regard him as outside the realm of orthodoxy. And I did hear it from people who do not fully know Rabbi Yosef Mesas and know him more through the writings of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, the few times that he does mention him, and they say, oh, it was not really within the mainstream of halakha, or he's not learned enough, or he doesn't base his arguments on sources. All this is not true. When first of all, when you see the full body of literature that Rabbi Yosef Mesas produced, his 3 books called Otzar HaMichtavim, the trove of letters, all of his writings, 2 volumes of Halakha called Haim, a book on the laws of Hanukkah and a book of the laws of Gittin, of divorces, as well as extensive commentary, 6 volumes of Pirkei Avot. He is an extremely knowledgeable man, well versed in all branches of Torah and many scientific, different scientific branches, grammar, languages, etc. He's a very learned and deeply rooted halachic man. Now, not only that, there are other books that Rabbi Ovadia Yosef does quote, even though they are much more revolutionary or not within the mainstream of halacha as rabbi-messas. One of the best examples is the book called Krach Shel Romi. This is taken from a midrashic reference to Rome. Rome was called, in rabbinic literature, was called Krach Shel Romi. Krach is a metropolis, so the metropolis of Rome. So there's a book of halakha written by Rabbi Israel Moshe Hazan, or Hazen, but his name in Hebrew is Hazan, like a cantor. Rabbi Israel Moshe Hazan, who was a rabbi in Rome in the 19th century, and Rabbi Ovadia Yosef quotes it regularly. So from both sides, we have a proof that the reason for rejecting the writings of Rabbi Yosef Mesas is not because of its content. Because on one hand, he does write within the confinements of the halachic methodology, and on the other hand, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef does quote people who fall out of that framework. So there must be a different reason. So going back to the article by Shapiro, we're going to just look at a couple of the examples that he deals with, like certain halachot. You could read later on the article, the description of his the scope of his work. He had Rabbi Mesas dealt with the mashgichim. There's a famous story with the butchers that would not accept hashgaha, would open on Shabbat, and he found a way to resolve the conflict with them. In many places within his responsa, he speaks about the concept of limud zichut. That's an important concept. I'm not going to get into details of specific halachot, but in general, the approach of Rabbi Yosef Mesas was limud zichut. Limud zichut meaning finding a point in favor or judging favorably. And his approach was that, the way we say it in the modern legal system, that one is innocent until proven guilty. So Rabbi Mesas said, unless you could prove that something is forbidden, let us assume that it is not. And in some situations, he would say this: if I see that people, as a whole, practice a certain thing that others consider to be not permitted, then I have to ask myself, are they all sinners? Or maybe what they're doing is permitted. That was his approach when he dealt with the issue of hair covering for women. The case that was brought in front of him was of a woman who got married in a small city in Algeria, and in a city called Oujda, on the border of Algeria and Morocco. So she was married in Oujda, And after a while, her husband received a position in Casablanca. And the woman said that as long as they lived in Uzda, she was fine with covering her hair. But now that they're going to go to the big city, to Casablanca, she wants to be a modern woman and not cover her hair. And that did not go well with the husband, did not go well with his parents. His parents got involved. There was a family feud. He went to work in Casablanca and left his wife behind. And they went back and forth for a while. And finally, they turned to Rabbi Yosef Mesas. And he said that his purpose from the very beginning was lishpot shalom la mishpaha. He wants to bring peace to that family, so they will not have this tension. So he was trying to find a way to say, and he realized that at this point, the bringing peace to the family would not be by convincing the woman to cover her hair, but rather by convincing the husband to accept the fact that she doesn't want to cover her hair. And he says, first he looked at the historical background, and he found out that if you look at the halachic literature, you only find prohibitions. He says, isur al isur, one on top of another, just layers of prohibitions. And that was not very helpful. He then looks at reality, and he says that in Morocco, in most cities of Morocco, women still cover their hair, but that has been changing since the French occupation. It says, Me'az bo'at Tzarfatim, from the time that the French took over Morocco, I don't know how to call it, invasion, conquest, annexation, whatever it was, but the occupation, but the French took over Morocco. He says, Me'az bo'at Tzarfatim, ishtana davar. Since they came to Morocco, the thing has changed, and more women do not cover their hair. And he says, Ve'i efshar le'achzir et hadavar. There's no way that we're going to turn time back. He's a realist, and he understands that there's no way that you're going to turn the clock back and to change reality. He says, because hadavar olech u'mishtaneh im itpatchut hazman bechol makom v'makom. Those are changes that have to do with the changes in culture and in society in each and every place. And it will just keep on making progress. It's not going to go back. He says then that in Tlemcen, when he came to Tlemcen in Algeria, he found out that even before the French came to Algeria, women did not cover their hair. And indeed, we have a testimony from Maharam al-Ashkar, Rabbi Moshe al-Ashkar, who was there already in the 1400s, and he says that when he came from Spain to Algeria, he was surprised to see that the local women did not cover their head. And that's interesting, by the way, because Maharam al-Ashkar comes from Christian Spain to Muslim Algeria, and it was under Christianity that women did cover their hair, and under Islam that they didn't. Quite contrary to what we would have thought today. So, referring to that, Rabbi Mesas says, I look at all these women, at all these families, and I realize that they're observant. Or in our parlance today, those are Orthodox women. And it says it's impossible to assume that they're all sinners. So what he says is that you have to have a paradigm shift. Instead of sticking with your decision that it's forbidden, and then looking at those women and saying they are sinners, I have to look at it, start from the other side. I look at these women and I say, here I have a group of observant Orthodox women. So that means that everything they do is okay, including not covering their hair. And in that he follows the ruling of Maharam al-Ashkar from about 500 years earlier, where he uses this phrase when he answers someone who wanted to rebuke the women and to force them to cover their hair. He says, Hanach lahem, let them be, after he explains it in halachic terms. He says, let them be, let them do as they do. Sheminhag imotehen akdoshot bidehen. They're following the practice of their holy mothers. Usually people say minhag avotehem bidehem, right? The minhag of your fathers, avotehem akdoshim. But Maharam al-Ashkar is particular on saying imoten akdoshot. What he says is, since they do that, and their mothers did that, and they're still kedushim, they're still holy and observant and part of the Orthodox world, it must be that what they're doing is right. So that is the concept of limud zechut, of trying to make sense of what is happening and see if you could fit it into the rulings of halakha, even if it was not done traditionally in the last 3 or 5 or 700 years. Find a certain basis for that, as much as possible. When it's impossible, it's impossible. But if you could do it, rabbi-messas would definitely go for it, as we saw in the many examples of halakha that we have analyzed throughout the course. We will take a break here and we'll continue that in the next session.